everybody to this third session for our global meeting at Equinox, going around the globe. And this time, at this point in time, it's over to Asia. And more specifically, today it so happens to be 3 speakers from India. So it's lovely to deep dive into India. So why are we doing this? Well, you can quote the Schuman Declaration from 1950 after World War II if you want, that says, world peace cannot be safeguarded without the making of creative efforts proportionate to the dangers which threaten it. So in this day and age, um, our conversation about what it means to be human, what it means to take care of this planet together and how to do it peacefully is more important than ever. So thank you so much for joining in this really important cause. Today we have me, Martin Iverson, and of course Lena, who's spearheading this. And we are going into the theme of knowledge in this session. And we have 3 wonderful speakers that will be speaking shortly. It's Sanchita Shekhar, it's Sahil Jha, and Barun Mitra. Welcome to you all. I think it's time for some practicalities, Lena. Is that right?
Yes, it is. So by now everybody is, I hope, used to Zoom meetings and being online together. One thing that I would like to ask of everybody is that if you're not one of the speakers or actively participating in the Q&A debate later, please keep your microphones muted, because if there's any noise in the background or if you sneeze or anything, you will end up in the video being the one who sneezes. And that does not look very good in the video. So now you're warned. The algorithm goes after where the sound is. So that's let's see. Robert writes something here. Yes, I need to click something for people to be able to share the screen. Okay. So please keep your microphone muted. And on the other hand, we've had one time a rude participant, and then I ended up muting him. I am the person with the mute button. So we expect everybody to be behaving well, but if somebody doesn't, we take care of it. And we have a very open mind with regards to freedom of speech and different viewpoints. But there are limits. So that's the practicalities of things. And then I would also like to share a few words about why we're here and the theme. A year ago, we launched the book, What It Means to Be Human, and that turned out to be a topic and an angle that people liked very much. We have 14 essays from around the globe with different Bildung traditions. I wrote one of them. I didn't write the other 13 ones, so I can actually say it's a very good book. And this theme about what it means to be human resonated with a lot of people. So we kept that as the overall theme, but we also decided to change the topic for the individual sessions or the individual events, so that there's a different aspect of this. And the last time it was cooperating and how do we cooperate better. This time it's about how do we relate better to each other. And why not connect? Why relate? Well, because connection can be abusive. They can be transactional. They can be part of corruption. But if you relate to people, there is something deeper in it. There's a mutual acceptance. There's a mutual connection. There's a mutuality in it in a different kind of way. So how do we relate better to each other as a species? How do we relate better to people, to the rest of the planet, also the animals, the atmosphere, the plants, everything, life on Earth? And how do we relate to our past, our present, and our future? And we have a shared heritage as humans, and so we do have a long past that goes back to the same roots. How do we relate to that? How do we relate to recent history and everything that we carry with us that is more recent and where we've been more divided and also collaborating? Um, and then there's the present, and then we need to relate to the future and figure out what kind of future is it that we want. And that is also part of what these discussions are about. And then to keep sort of a structure and a progression in it, we have 8 different themes. We got 8 sessions or 8 culture zones. We started with indigenous culture and what that means to us. We then focused on justice, and in this one, we're going to focus on knowledge. And we will move on. And there is a paper that I wrote where you can read more about it, and we can share that in the chat. So that's the practicalities and the background. And then we actually have a little task for you, right, Martin?
That's right. Yeah. So we have a question for you, and I think it's already in the chat, and some people have gone at it already. That's great. So basically, take 2 minutes of your time and just jot down on a piece of paper if you want, or straight into the chat, uh, what would make us relate better to other people and or to the planet. And spoiler, we will make a word cloud out of each session later, so you can actually see how we collectively think in the word cloud. So please give a minute and a half to think about this and write down in the chat.
We got stories, simple solidarity, curiosity, empathy, love. Good. Corruption is in there. Um, that's an interesting way of relating, but trust and interest. um, Empathy, communication, curiosity, participatory knowing, cognitive synchronization, wisdom cultivation. Awesome. So Robert is now gonna gather all the answers and make ourselves a word cloud, and we'll have a word cloud picture of the session. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you. Yeah, and so now here's how things will work now. We will have our 3 speakers tell us about their subjects of the day and following in succession. And after that, we will have a breakout session where we, in groups of 3 to 4 people, discuss or a dialogue on what was it that we just heard and how does that relate to relating and so forth. So first off will be Sanchita Shekhar. She's a passionate advocate with extensive experience in peace, conflict resolution, and research. She's worked with refugees, prisoners of war, and tribal communities, conducting impactful research on health systems and policy analysis. And currently, she's working with Jan Swastika Sahyog to shape healthcare policy in India. And the theme today is knowledge, and there are different ways of knowing things. So Sanchita will take us through her thoughts and angles on this. Over to you, Sanchita.
I have a presentation, so I'm going to share my screen. Just give me a second. But in the meantime, I can introduce myself. My name is Sanchita. I am from India. So I currently work for an organization called Jan Swastika Sahyog, like Martin shared, and what I do is I do research. I do research with indigenous communities. So basically I'm working with tribal groups and we're working on the gaps of the public infrastructure on reaching the last mile or reaching indigenous communities in rural parts of India. So that's what I'm currently doing.
And I think from what you wrote about the theme of the day, you're going to look at different ways of seeing the world, and for example, indigenous, traditional, modern, and postmodern perspectives. And this is very much Bildung territory, and we really look forward to see how that applies in India.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, the question that you shared on the chat was, Lena, I've sent you an email. So the question that shared in the chat has been a question that I've been exploring for the past year, working with this organization, because the kinds of knowledge that we have is very, and the way we explore the kinds of knowledge that we have, I believe, is very different depending on the community that you're living in. So it's been very interesting for me doing the work that I've been doing because I do research, right? It's very systematic approach to a lot of things. And the communities I work with are tribal and indigenous, and they don't value the same systems and this way of thinking and seeing the world. So I've had some very interesting experiences working with them because I've been trying to make things structured and solid, and they've been telling me that this is nonsense. So it's been very interesting working with them, but it's also been so beautiful to learn some of their culture and traditions and to recognize some of the very real things that we've been missing living in cities. So those are things I'm definitely going to dive into a little bit more. So knowledge is, yeah, one of those things I've been thinking about for a long time. So my presentation is K for Knowledge. It's based on the article that Lena wrote, so please take a look at it whenever you have time. It's a beautiful article. Can you go to the next slide for me, please? Yeah, so I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the entire talk. So I'm going to first introduce who I am. I think I've already started doing some of that, but I'll go into a little bit more detail. I also want to talk about what is knowledge, what is the definition of knowledge, the etymology of the word, where did it come from? And then I also want to talk about the different kinds of knowledge that we want to talk about a little bit more in detail. I'll also give stories and examples from some of the work that I've done. And then I want to talk a little bit more about integrating knowledge. So if we all have different kinds of knowledge and we're all working within different communities that have access to different kinds of knowledge, how do we put it together? And then the last part is, and then what? So what's the implications of doing that and why do we need to do this? Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the introduction. So my name is Sanchita. As you can see on my hair, that's my name. I have lived in 4 continents and I've traveled to over 30 countries. So I've spent a big part of my life traveling, living across the world. And currently I live in a very remote part of India within the tribal belt. And I work with indigenous communities here. I live with them, I work with them, and I identify some of the gaps that are existing from the governmental side on access to public healthcare and access to any other services that they might need. So it's very ethnographic. That's what I've been doing. I also have a very deep commitment to knowledge. I went to 7 different schools in 3 countries growing up, and it just gave me this very different view of the education system around the world. And it's one of those things that built my curiosity about the way things are done differently. I've also worked with very unique groups of people throughout my career and throughout my time studying. So I've worked with refugees and prisoners of war and lawyers and activists. And I've also spent some time in monasteries and ashrams. So I've spent time with monks and peacekeepers. So yeah, all this to say that knowledge is something that I've been exploring for a long time and it's very important to me. So I'm excited to do this conversation and to speak about this a little bit more. Okay, so now we're going to talk about knowledge and what is knowledge. So this is the definition from the Oxford Dictionary. So knowledge is a noun. I know this is quite basic, but I think we should start from definitions. I'm a researcher, so we start at the start, right? Okay, so this is the definition I got from Oxford Dictionary, right? The first definition was that knowledge is just facts, information, and skills acquired through experience or education. Right? It's theoretical or practical understanding of a subject. So the reason I want to talk about the definition is because I want to go, as we further go into the talk, I want to start dissecting who defines knowledge and what kind of definitions do we use and who makes these definitions and who is it for, right? So I think these definitions will start giving us some of those ideas. So that's the first definition. The second definition of knowledge is that it's the sum of what is known. So it's what we know. And the third definition is a philosophical definition, and that is the awareness or familiarity gained by the experience of a fact or a situation. So all of this to say that I think knowledge and the way we define knowledge is very logical, it's very, very abstract, but it is not really grounded in the way some certain communities might experience knowledge. So that's something to think about. Next slide, please. Thank you. So where does the word knowledge itself come from? So it comes from, in the 12th century, it comes from this word called knowledge, and it means acknowledgement of someone superior, or an acknowledgement of a certain form of authority. And that's what we assume to be knowledge. Over time, it grew into something which is more based on fact, more based on news, the information that we gather, the kind of teachings that we have, and all of these things became what we know today as knowledge. So the question is, who defines knowledge, who gets to define knowledge, and who takes this definition of knowledge to be what knowledge is, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we go into traditional and indigenous communities and their knowledge. But something to think about is who's making these definitions and who's it for. So the first kind of knowledge that I want to talk about is indigenous knowledge. This is the communities of people that I've been working with currently, so I have a lot of interest in this kind of knowledge, but it's also very interesting and very different to the kinds of knowledge that I was exposed to before this. So the indigenous communities that I work with, the tribals, they live in the forests. Oftentimes they don't have access to much of the public healthcare that we have access to. A lot of them do. So one of the first things I learned when I work with a public health organization, and one of the first things I learned about the community that I'm working with currently, they have a very deep connection to nature, but they also have a very noticeable lack of connection with the public health structure that the government sets up, right? And this is because some of these things are very alien to them. They do their own. So a few examples. One of the first things I learned was that in the communities that we work with, women deliver their own babies. They don't do it in an institution. They don't do it with the help of anybody. Oftentimes it's by themselves. And I think when you look at developing countries and you look at countries where you have a lot of people who are living more remotely, women tend to deliver their own babies, and they do it outside of an institution. That's also why there's a lot more deaths when there's complications, because they don't know how to deal with it. But in general, they have a very deep connection to their body. They know the kind of food to eat. They grow their own food. And also their social structures are very different. They're very community oriented, and they're not really formal structure oriented at all. And I'll give you a very good example of this shortly. They also have a very relationship to money, and they're very community minded. So one of the experiences that I've had working with this community has been that if I have to work 30 days a month, right? And we tend to work in formal structures. So we work for 30 days a month, and then whatever money we make that is beyond what we need, we tend to save it, or we invest it, or we do different things with it. What they tend to do oftentimes is, if they need a specific amount of money, they work 3 days a month, they get that money, and then they just take 25 days off. And they don't see any reason to come to work after that. And they believe that they just need money for them to meet their requirements that they have at that specific point in time. But they're not very, they don't think too much about what happens 2 years down the line, 10 years down the line. They're a lot more focused on the moment than they are focused on long-term structures and safety as a concept. A few other examples that I can give you about indigenous knowledge is, and their relationship to our structures is, there was this child I was talking to, and the government has built schools in some places that I'm working in, and for these children to come and study. And very frequently, some of these children come to school and then they just run away, and then they keep running away. And every day, a big part of the time that the teachers spend in school is trying to go and retrieve these children and bring them back. And whenever a child runs away, the other children cheer them on. So it's become this thing where the children who run away are great, and the children who don't, who are in formal educational structures, are not really accepted in this community, because they don't have any concept of formal education, they don't have any concept of formal structures, they don't have any concept of formal work. Another example that I can give of this is that there was this meeting I was having with a group of women from one of the tribes, and all of them came to the meeting and they all fell asleep in the middle of the meeting. And this was really weird to me because imagine I was talking and everybody here fell asleep. But they told me that, hey, this is the time we sleep and this is just what happens. And we are not used to sitting in a meeting for 3 hours and being present because that's just weird, right? So we had to change the way we run meetings with them. So we give them time to sleep and we give them food and we do things differently because they don't prescribe to some of these structures that we have and we run. So that's a little bit about indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways of being that I've worked with. Traditional knowledge is a little bit about what is passed down from generations. I think it's what we oftentimes call culture. It's something that happens that is passed down from families across generations. This includes like superstitions, and this also includes like religious ideologies and social structures. I have a really good example of this as well. So when I was working in one of the field areas, there was a 3-hour traffic jam. And so we were trying to figure out, why is there a traffic jam? There must have been an accident. Eventually, we get out of the car, we go to the front of the traffic jam, try to figure out what happened. And there was no accident. So we asked the driver in the front, we're like, hey, why have you stopped? And there's lots of people behind you. And this person says, a black cat crossed my path and we are not supposed to go forward after the cat has come. So we can't go ahead and nobody else can go ahead. So now we're not going to move. So that traffic jam just continued onward because it's a superstitious belief that if a black cat crosses the road in front of you, you're not allowed to go. So everyone was just stuck behind them because that is what is a very strongly held belief in this community. And I think that's a very good example of traditional knowledge. And not all of it is bad. It can be amusing. It's also something that sustains over a long period of time, and it's very valuable. Yeah, and then there's modern knowledge. I really like this because I do research. So it's very logic oriented, it's very practical, it's very hypothesis testing. You start with an idea, and then you try to figure out, is this the right idea, by doing systematic research, right? It's measurement oriented, it's evidence based, and you're trying to find what is objectively true. But honestly, I think modern knowledge also fails where indigenous and traditional knowledge comes in, because indigenous and traditional knowledge is not always practical. It's a lot more body-based, it's a lot more wisdom-based, it's a lot more traditional-based, but modern knowledge is very good at identifying what objectively works in certain cases. Yeah, and this is also something I'm really fond of, and this is what I do for a living, so. Yeah, and then there's postmodern knowledge, which is a deconstruction of the world around us. You're trying to figure out why are certain things happening the way they're happening. And I think this requires a very different kind of structure and is really not possible in certain situations and settings where people are where people are spending a majority of their time on survival and their needs being met. Postmodern knowledge really requires structures where people have their needs met and then have the capacity to break down and deconstruct the way such structures and societies around us are created, right? So examples of this could be gender identities or any other postmodern concept, which is similar to that. So I want to talk a little bit about integrating knowledge. So we've just spoken about 4 very different kinds of knowledge, but one of the things that I think I've learned over the course of my life, but also over the course of the work that I've been doing, has been how do you integrate some of these very different kinds of knowledge, and how do you start some of those conversations? Because sometimes these conversations are so difficult to do when the kind of structure that you're in is so different from the kinds of structures that the person in front of you is in, who comes from a very different knowledge structure. For example, I can't sit down in a meeting with somebody who's from an indigenous community because they're not going to understand the concept of a meeting, right? But they're also not going to understand the concept of deconstructing the way society is because they're a lot more present in the moment, which are things that we could really benefit from. But I think until these conversations start happening about so until these conversations start happening about how can we take the best things from each kind of knowledge, which functions under very different structures, we're not going to be able to, in my opinion, solve very big world problems. So I think we need to talk a little bit about what kinds of structures store certain kinds of knowledge. So I want to talk a little bit about the kind of structures that are required for each kind of knowledge and why they're necessary. So, for example, the kind of place that you live in and the kind of people you're surrounded by shapes a big part of the kind of knowledge that you have access to and the kind of knowledge that you can attain, right? For example, if you live in the middle of Manhattan and you have a corporate job, it's almost impossible for you to say, I'm taking a week off because my body feels like it needs a week off, which is something that someone from an indigenous community can say. But not just can they say, it is socially acceptable for them to say so. And it's also something that there's a feedback loop that's created, is they take a certain action and the society follows through, they're culturally acceptable, right? So in order for us to start talking about how to integrate this knowledge, we have to start creating structures that help us integrate this knowledge. So for example, in a corporate job in New York where there is no space for mental health, for example, these are still conversations that are starting, but indigenous knowledge is so much more rooted in the earth and in the soil and in the weather, where they're able to take time to connect with the soil, to connect with the kind of food they're eating. They don't eat the same kinds of food all year round, right? They're very seasonal, but work that is in a certain structure in a society where things are supposed to be on 24/7 does not fit in that kind of knowledge. So we're going to have to put different kinds of people in the same room who are used to very different structures in order for us to even start a conversation. And until we start these conversations, I think some of these big problems that we have, they cannot be solved because everybody has a piece of the puzzle. And until you put everybody in the same room who are used to different things, we're not going to be able to start talking about some of these bigger things. So why do we need to do this? I'm just going to very quickly glance over this. We need to solve complex problems and we need everybody to sit down and share the kinds of knowledge that we have and for us to put it together. These big problems include hunger, poverty, and climate change. If we're solving problems for certain people, they have to be at the table. And we have to know what kind of situations to create to make them comfortable on that table. The second thing is, if we need greater harmony and we need fewer wars and community and connection with nature and ourselves, we need to be able to integrate all of these different kinds of knowledge, because every single kind of knowledge has wisdom and has things that are important. And also integrating these kinds of knowledge is very important for your physical health and for your mental health and for the health of society at large. So it's really important to put these things together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And here's a lot to think about. So solving complex problems, systemic big things like planet and what have you, and the relationships between us people and of course the systems that we have, plus our own health. There's a lot to unpack there. Thank you so much. We are still waiting for Sahil Jha to join. I think he's still somewhere on a bicycle. So, Lena, what do you say? Should Barun Mitra maybe come on?
Yeah, I think we'll just move on to the next speaker, and if Sahil shows up, we have 10 minutes for each speaker. So we'll give him his 10 minutes, and if he doesn't show up, we'll go to breakout rooms.
Perfect. So we are over to Barun Mitra, also from India, an engineer by training, but had been working on a range of public policies for 25 years, and then realizing the ever-widening gulf between the public and policies, and in trying to figure out what is this and what should we do about it, discovered or rediscovered or has been diving into the teachings of Gandhi and how he sees education, or rather maybe the Bildung form that is so much more than just book knowledge. But I'm sure you will take us into this world, Barun, and we really look forward to see what you have to say about this.
Hello. Thank you, Martin. I don't know if I can say or tell anything to anyone, because to me, education is a journey to learn myself. And I've had to last 10 years almost I've spent on unlearning what I learned in the previous 30 years or 40 years. So yeah, so it's been a hell of a ride, to say the least. Yeah. So
Tell us about your roller coaster.
yeah, it is. In a sense that when we talk of problems or when we talk of policies, what I discovered was that they're generally disconnected from the people, from the public. While we are talking of public policy, we don't really have the public in mind. We just think the public to be a passive element who will just sign up to what wise people like us might have to say. And I did that for much of my time, innocently perhaps. But I began to realize there's a disconnect. And that made me go back to somebody I was not really looking at, which is Gandhi. Because if anyone could connect to people at a scale that is even today almost unprecedented, unbelievable, is Gandhi. How could he communicate? How could he reach out? How could he completely bypass the formal structures of education? And I think uh, what I find critical is that are we looking at education as a way to acquire some information or some skills or some applications, or are we looking at education as a way to develop ourselves? And I'm sure Gandhi was not alone. There are people from the 19th century who have been saying it, but Gandhi did say that I quote, by education, I mean an all-round drawing out of the best in the child and man body and man in terms of body, mind, and spirit. That is the head, hand, and the heart bit. Although I think the original quote of the 3H comes from somebody in Poland, perhaps in the 19th century. But much of what he was talking of, although Gandhi himself got a very formal education and was trained as a lawyer, a barrister from England, and practiced as one for almost 2 decades in South Africa. His trust in the formal infrastructure of society, particularly as those tended to be more taken over by the state, he became very apprehensive, which I thought was quite amazing for somebody in the 19th century and somebody, if you look at the state today and the state in at the end of the 19th century, there's a huge difference in terms of scale and scope. Yet Gandhi could get a sense of what's the problem with the formal structures of the state that we are so keen to build or so focused on. I think so education became a continuous lifelong experiment for Gandhi. He tried it with some pretty high costs to himself and his family. Two of his eldest sons, the 2 elder sons of the 4 sons that he had, really struggled to cope up with Gandhi's approach to education, and the family paid a huge price. But what I find interesting is that not what he said, but how he experimented. And his autobiography is titled "My Experiments with Truth." And here is a man who died at the age of 78, but didn't stop experimenting till the last day of his life almost. And what do we mean by experiments? Like today in the world of science, we hear a lot about this word called experiments. But experiment to me primarily means an acknowledgement that our knowledge is limited. That it's an acknowledgement that the knowledge is limited, and therefore to cultivate a comfort zone and acknowledge the uncertain and the unknown. Because typically what happens is the moment we see something that is uncertain or unknown, we become fearful or we become anxious and either shut ourselves out or simply run away or refuse to look at those uncertain aspects. Whereas a whole purpose of experiment is to test what is known and push at the boundaries of what is unknown and what is uncertain so that the knowledge expands, which means that the experiment is actually a way to explore and push at the horizon of what one knows or understands. And then it becomes, once we get the sense of experiment and exploration, we might be able to get a sense of, sense of peace with ourselves and a sense of joy at finding out whatever, irrespective of whether it proves us right or wrong. So right or wrong, or the outcomes become secondary. It's the journey that becomes primary, which I thought was really fascinating for in today's world in the 21st century, that it's the journey that matters rather than the ends, because the ends will always come with certain degree of unknowns and uncertainty, no matter how hard we try. But it's the journey, if we can enjoy and internalize that journey of learning, so that learning is a companion for the rest of our lives, then I think it solves a lot of our problems. And one last bit that I might say is, that one problem in the traditional way of education is that mistakes are looked down upon. For instance, if we score less in our school or university exams, we feel let down. Whereas a mistake is actually a stepping stone for something to learn in future. Instead of hiding the mistake, or instead of learning through strategies such as rote learning or copying or any other strategies that we may have to reduce our sense of making an error, the less we are actually learning. And this means, this to me looks like, and perhaps best reflected in how we are unable, most of the time, we are unable to talk to ourselves. For instance, if I take my own example, I spent 25, 30 years of my life trying to talk about public policy, advocating whatever policies we thought was suitable and appropriate for India and the world, whatever. But the whole presumption was that we knew. And we tried to disprove any critique that came our way. Whereas what Gandhi showed was that the issue is not to disprove anyone. Issue is to have a dialogue, have an exchange with ourselves and with others. Try to understand the diversity of perspectives so that you can find some common ground. And the difference is not between the person who's committing a mistake, but to distinguish between the person and any mistake that there might be. In a religious sense, perhaps one could say the distinction one draws between the sinner and the sin. Somebody who's doing something wrong, the wrongness of that act, and the person who's engaged in it for whatever reason. This distinction that we are very quick to draw, or to label others, that somebody is wrong or somebody is mistaken, we seem to find it very difficult to apply it to ourselves. To me, I'm amazed that when I started in this world of public policy, the word echo chamber didn't exist. But what I and most other friends of mine and anyone who's interested or involved in engaged in public policy, I think we are trapped in the world of echo chambers, because we assume that our knowledge is complete when in fact it is not. we assume that we know and the other person doesn't, and the critics surely who are critics, they are not wrong. So we try to disprove them rather than win them over. And I think this is one of the fundamental aspects of education that I see in Gandhi, that it was virtually impossible for him to look at anyone as an enemy. And no matter how sinful or how wrong an act might have been, he is always looking at the person and believe holding him to be capable of recognizing the mistake and rectifying and moving on. And that process, that approach, that way of relating to oneself and to others, I think is something that the current, I mean, not just the current, perhaps in the last 100, 150 years of formal institutions and education, we seem to have lost. So yeah, so I really need to know how we look at education. Is it something that we tell and teach others, or is it something that is a process by which we learn ourselves? Is a teacher someone who knows, or is a teacher is somebody who's actually demonstrating the art of learning in the classrooms, so that the student learns how to learn rather than looking up to the teacher as the font of knowledge and therefore try to copy. Yeah, so I'd really like to explore this relationship between education and how it connects to experiments and exploration and enjoyment, so that we have a more fulfilling life rather than the compartmentalized ones that we seem to be getting into increasingly. Thank you. I hope I made some sense.
Very much. Thank you. You're leaving us more confused than when we started, which I think is a great point. Thank you so much. And it is interesting. Someone said, I don't know if it's an idiom, but if you think you're done educating or getting educated, you're not educated, you're done. So
exactly.
Yeah, it's a journey. And it's I would say a lot of the reason why we are join today. We are supposed to be on a journey together, and I think we are. And speaking about mistakes, we're actually in the next session gonna come back to the gift of making mistakes and learning from them, right, Lina? That at least that's the plan.
Yes. Yes, we are. And it's funny because this is the second session where somebody has mentioned the importance of making mistakes. So we can promise that we will make mistakes during the day, and we even have it as a topic when we get to the Middle East. So on that note, we're gonna right now stay focused on what we just heard, and I'm gonna send you all out into breakout rooms, except the speakers, because if we send them out, they'll just keep speaking, and we want you to speak to each other. So I got 4 really cool breakout rooms here, and they're only nice people, and I can only highly recommend that when you get there, you start by introducing yourselves to each other, so you know that who you're with. And then we have 3 questions that we would like you to discuss. The first one is, what did we just hear? The second one is, what did we learn? And what would be a good question to ask the speakers? So you got 15 minutes, 16 minutes, and have fun.
So there's a common thread already. Mistakes, Lynette.
Mistakes and time.
And time. Hmm. Hmm. And relativity.
Oh.
Yeah. Hmm. I've been reflecting a little bit about knowledge as a term, because you had the etymology and you had the definition. So basically, it's what someone called. I really like the phrase suitcase word. So it's what it means is you have a word that everybody knows, but they put different meanings on it. So it's like a suitcase with a label, let's say knowledge on the suitcase, and then you open it, and then you find very many different definitions, all hiding under the same label, meaning there's plenty of room for confusion when you speak about knowledge, for example. I found that a bit helpful, and you sorted them out into the indigenous and traditional and modern, postmodern. You didn't go into meta-modern or that type of thing, Sanchita. Is that on purpose or?
Yeah, also I just didn't I thought it was already complicated. I just didn't want it to become something that was just impossible to understand. So
Mm, mm,
also, I just think some of these concepts, it's been, for me, it's been an interesting journey because I think I've lived in so many different parts of the world. But some of these concepts of postmodern knowledge, metamodern knowledge, these things have not even come down to like the global south. These are not concepts that people talk about or words that people would understand if
mm.
you use. So I think it's also something I'm starting to understand is the way that knowledge is concentrated in parts of the world is also different. Um,
You also talked to me, I can't remember where anymore, Lena, but I mean, one concept or one interesting aspect of these different types of knowledge is typically if you do, let's say, a more advanced or later stage knowledge, like postmodern, from an earlier stage, if you haven't encompassed the newer one, it
A
looks,
more complex one.
yeah, it looks immoral. It looks sinful.
Oh, I mean, so
Um,
if you come from the older, smaller group episteme or meaning making, you cannot grasp the other one. It's simply it's a different planet. You do not have a language, you do not have the concept for it, and it literally breaks down the way that you're meaning making already if you're gonna accept it.
mm,
Later you can reconstruct both of them and have both of them inside your head and in your meaning making, but they're incompatible because they simply look at different parts of the world. Unless you really learn to handle both of them. And I like to refer to complexity and size of society because earlier, later doesn't, I mean, they all coexist. But from the bigger society, from the more complex perspective, the less complex one, or from a smaller society, looks incomplete, or we tend to say primitive. And it's not just a white thing we came up with in colonial era. I mean, the Babylonians talked about the villagers and the people outside the big cities as primitive. So it's something we've done for 5 or 6,000 years. So, but because it's, or simplistic could be a way. It's like, no, it doesn't give us all the answers that we need. There's simply not enough explanation power in it for the situation that we're in. And I mean, and the Taliban is a really interesting phenomenon from this perspective because they are a traditional society. I love the example with the cat, by the way. I mean, they're a traditional society with modern, postmodern technologies, and they insist on traditional meaning making and a caliphate from a pre-modern, based on pre-modern concepts, but they have modern weapons to uphold it with. So, so they're using the technology. I mean, they're using technologies they would never be able to produce themselves. And which makes, for instance, as a comparison, the Amish people really interesting because they also live in a pre-modern world, in a modern world. But they just use it for meaning making in their own community and have figured out how to have. I'm not sure I would want to live there, not as a woman, definitely. Uh, but um, but I would rather live with them than with the Taliban. So they've figured out a way of balancing or living in the pre-modern meaning making in a modern, postmodern world and having a somewhat meaning relationship with their surroundings, and definitely very peaceful people. So yeah, different kinds of knowledge, and they just don't. It's like oil and water. Um, both are good, but for different things. Sanchita, you disagree or wonder?
No, I agree with you. I think I've been having this internal conflict because the communities I've been working with have a very different way of making meaning in their own life. And I think sometimes if I'm ever in a conflict with them, for whatever reason, I'm just like, hey, I don't like this thing that you did. Can we talk about it? And then they're just like, nobody has ever said this to us, right? Because their way of dealing with things is just so different. And I think I spent the first 6 months while I was here just being like, I think you guys are wrong because you just don't have any capacity to like apologize and make amends and figure things out that to me are super basic. But then I think over time, I'm realizing that they just can't. And it's fundamentally incompatible. And I just don't know what to do about it. And now I don't know what that means for me personally. Is that doesn't work for me. And this doesn't work for them. So I read that book, Martin.
Have you? This is Lena's book. Have you read it? So I think this framework that you have on this page,
Yeah,
is pretty
that's
good.
yeah.
So this really speaks to the same structure that you have.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's polymodernity. I have a whole book dedicated to it. I'm pointing to this boxes with books that I have right next to me.
it's a book selling event.
I mean, you can have the indigenous culture in a small society where everybody knows everybody because you can read body language among everybody, which means that you don't have to regulate with legislation and sort of a hierarchical power of any kind, because you can see if people are thriving and you can talk to everybody and you can resolve conflicts. But once you get beyond, I don't know, 500, 2,000, and definitely 10,000 people, that just doesn't work anymore. So you have to have different structures, you have to have different kinds of knowledge, you have to have different kinds of ways of operating. And then when you have millions of people, you can't use the pre-modern traditional way because you can't all have the same religion. You can't all have the exact same explanation for everything. You need to negotiate viewpoints, and you need to have a more flexible political structure that can readapt to change circumstances. And religion really is not very good at that. So with group sizes, something happens, and then of course, in order to keep those bigger groups together, people come up with communication technology. And so now we have communication technology that goes all the way around the globe. And we have postmodern, modern societies that can almost handle it. I'm not saying it's going very well everywhere. And then you have traditional societies where it's just, tearing everything apart. And it's also going to tear all the indigenous cultures apart unless we figure out a way to maintain their kinds of knowledge when they're in their smaller communities, because once they're outside in the bigger communities, their structures are not capable of handling that.
Barun, I see you're thinking deeply.
Yeah, I've actually got a question for both of them, Sanchita and Lena. If we look at think of a spectrum with information at one end and truth at the other, where would knowledge be? What would be the position of knowledge in a spectrum? If we think it's a straight line, one could say it's a circle.
So, I mean, what was information and what was the other thing?
Truth. Truth. Yeah. What's true? How do we know what's true? And the question I had for Lena, and actually I mentioned it in the earlier session, although I listened to only part of it, is this relationship between simple and complex society. Is it a function of law? That is law, that is formal institutions of law, because every society has some elements of law, largely informal, mostly, I mean, in smaller and more traditional societies, or even families. They have customs and norms which are not enforced by the state and the law, but they are customs by mutual acceptance of whatever. But this relationship between simple and complex, if it's being governed by or shaped by the nature of law, then the question to ask is, particularly if I take the example that you gave, that the companies who can create these technologies and span the world, would they have been possible without the architecture of law? And if we think that these mega structures would be impossible to sustain without the architecture of law, then the question to ask is, do we need that kind of a law? Or isn't the law, by facilitating such mega structures, is actually becoming prone or being captured by those structures for their own good, which is inevitable? So how do we look at law? Because I think that's the word that we haven't heard probably since this Bildung began. Law meaning the law that is governed and enforced and created by agencies of the state, that is formal institutions of law. I'm not talking of the informal institutions. The reason I think this is relevant is because the latest team of economists who got the Nobel Prize last year in 2024, I think that is one of their key insights, that we need to figure out a way to balance the formal and the informal institutions. What we have today is the formal institutions running amok, steamrolling virtually anything that is informal and outside, and then getting itself captured by the interests that have an interest in perpetuating the scale and the complexity, because then they can maximize their own benefits and power. Yeah.
So I mean, so there's or say there's algorithms and there's law. There are two different structures of organizing interaction. And then we have ethics and we got moral values. And as a society, we haven't really started talking algorithms yet very much, but we keep mixing up or messing up law, ethics, and moral values because there are a lot of things that are legal, but a lot of people would find immoral. For instance, lying. There are different kinds of lies that are illegal, but if I told you that I had spent all day yesterday at the beach, that's legal. I wasn't there. It's a lie, but we're allowed. I mean, the government won't put us in prison for telling a lie like that. If I said that Sanchita had robbed a bank and I knew it as a fact and called the police, that would not be a legal lie. So we have these things that are legal, but we wouldn't want people to go around practicing them. Cheating on your spouse is another one. So so we need to, first of all, we need to have a clear language. It's really good that Sanchita started with knowledge and clearing that up. But with regards to instruments of power, and that's where the law and monopoly on violence and then algorithms are now actually in a fight over what is going to be the strongest power of the two. And we haven't had started that conversation yet. Now we have people coming back from the breakout rooms.
Exactly. Welcome back. I hope and trust you had a great time among friends.
We have some people who don't want to leave yet, so
yeah, that's a good sign.
that's a very good sign. But now it does shut down, so they have to join us.
Mm.
Welcome back.
Welcome, Christopher. And all of you, welcome back from the breakout sessions. I hope and trust you had fruitful dialogues with friends from around the globe. I really love the fact that we're going around the globe. I think it's, it's quite rare that people, organizations do this. And for those of you that have the stamina to follow around the globe, you will see the different types of let's say flavors or nuances to the different dialogues that will happen. But there's also a very thick common thread between them. And this time it is partly to do with mistakes, obviously. And we'll get back to that. If you stay for the next session, we're actually going to come back to the gift of making mistakes. So connecting from previous session into this one and the next. Yeah, so I hope that you have remembered to try to reflect on the questions we had for you. So what did we just hear? What did we learn? And what would be good questions for further, let's say, deep dive into dialogue about understanding and being enriched by what the speakers said. Lena, do you have anything to add?
No, I just wonder what kind of questions we have from the chats or the breakout rooms.
Yeah.
Very quick note for any new attendees, because we have a couple. There's a Padlet link in your chat. We'd like you to go in there, click the plus sign in the lower right corner, and put in where you are coming from. And you'll already see there's quite a broad array of folks from around the world who've attended already. Thank you.
Thank you. Lena, do we prefer to have these written down for a more...
I think, I mean, it's a good group size, so I think we should just let people raise their hand when if they want to ask a question, and then do it organically.
And then, yeah, Vladan was first, so floor is yours, Vladan.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I was in a breakout room with Mikhail and Halina. So here's the thing: we were discussing too much, so we did not formulate a question at the end. But one of the main topics we were discussing was this knowledge and habits. So what is knowledge? What are habits? But also, if knowledge is enough, because we used examples of former Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union societies where there was knowledge, there was education, people were getting knowledge, but what happened at the end of the day? What happened, in a long term? So the conclusion was that it's not enough knowledge, but you need to constantly analyze, develop, and think about what knowledge is and implement it in practice. And that's kind of also relating to discussion about India and Gandhi and engagement. So the question could be, for example, how do we, constantly improve our understanding of knowledge, and if what we are doing in practice is, right or wrong? How do we manage that in everyday lives?
Okay. Yeah, I guess it's open for Sanchita or Barun for your reflections on that.
Okay, I can take a stab at this. So I think the first thing maybe for you to ask is try to figure out is maybe one of the things I would do is try to figure out what kind of knowledge is the groups that I'm connecting with, what level of knowledge are they at, and what level of knowledge is acceptable, and then try to figure out what kind of knowledge do you want to acquire by relationship to that group, or if you want to choose to self-select into different group, what kind of knowledge would you like to select into? I think this idea of truth and what is good or what is bad is very subjective, and I think those things can maybe change depending on where you're at. And I think also accumulating knowledge is always something that is, and I think accumulating knowledge relative to like what you think would be good or bad or right or wrong is really subjective and dependent on the communities that you're connected to. So if you connect to a different community, your idea of right and wrong and good and bad would really change. So I think these are things for you to keep in mind when you're thinking about how do you want to acquire knowledge, what kind of knowledge do you want to acquire, and maybe would that really be beneficial for you in the long run? But Barun, if you would like to add anything.
I think the issue, the values, of course, differ from place to place and time to time, but the values are not constant. They change. The question is to understand how do they change. Otherwise it becomes like a value-free world. Everyone has their own values, and therefore there's nothing to debate because it's my value versus someone else's, and it's all subjective, and therefore nothing matters. But then that's not how societies function. And that's not how, and that is why I think the truth becomes so critical, because the truth is a journey. It's a shared journey that a society and a community undertakes to find its place. find a common denominator where they could all agree upon at a particular point in time. The truth is not the the truth with a capital T, that is the ultimate truth, but it's a truth with a small t. And it's a search, it's a continuous experimentation and exploration to see what meets the current requirement. And therefore, it's also a continuous dialogue. And this is where I think the scale becomes an issue, because in a small community, the scales are direct. Whereas in a large community, the formal institutions take over and the scales become simply impossible to even visualize for anyone. And the challenge is coming in this mismatch, complete mismatch, I believe, between a community where all of us live, including our families, and the nations and the states and the international organizations who, through law, are casting a shadow. Because the law, after all, is a manifestation of violence, as Gandhi would say, that every action of the state is a manifestation of violence, and it is being done through law. No state, most states don't claim that they're doing something outside the law. And which is why I think it's very important to distinguish between these terminologies that we use, that how and when does information become facts, how and when the facts tend towards knowledge, how and when the knowledge tends towards wisdom, that is the good and bad of it, and the truth that the society as a whole, wherever the society is, they determine it, they agree on it. And to what extent we are being influenced, or the community is being influenced by external forces, which typically comes through law. Because I'm not distinguishing law from corporate entities, because the corporate entities are themselves functions of law. None of the large algorithmic companies would exist if corporate law recognizing corporations as an entity didn't exist. So just think for a moment that would a company exist if the law did not permit or recognize a company, a limited liability company, to exist? Or should we take it as given? Or yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Lena. I think the framework that you've been holding forth, called the circles of belonging, might cast some light on this also. What belongs where, and the different spheres of society, so to speak, or the largeness of it. I don't know. Do you have anything to add from that angle?
I mean, the smaller the community, the less legislation you need. If you have millions of people and you don't want the strongest people to just beat up the weaker ones, you do need a law and order. The question is, of course, are the laws just, and do people who live under the laws find them just? And there is really bad law and there is very good law, or legislation. So I don't think there's one answer to that, except that lawlessness rarely works. I think that the size of society really does matter, how depending on how we can organize ourselves. It also works the other way. If you imagine a family and you say, we're not going to be based on rule of law in this family, and we're going to vote every time we're going to have a meal, or we're going to make a new piece of legislation every time we're going to go grocery shopping. I mean, and we or I, as the head of the household, will just dictate what the legislation is for everybody. That family would fall apart if you didn't have that, if the relating inside the family was not built on the openness of how to regulate behavior. So that's different circumstances and different answers. I think we should go to Lars, who raised his hand.
Okay, I'll go. So thank you, Sanchita and Barun. I thought it was very inspiring. I really liked your speeches. Thank you very much for that. While you were speaking, I was thinking that, well, there are two ways of living your life. One is as if life is a dangerous walk in the jungle, and there would be a dangerous animal over there and the snake, and you're kind of walking around and being afraid. And the other one is as if life is an exciting adventure. Okay, what's going on? I wonder what happens on the corner of the next second, and who are you and who am I? And just an exciting adventure. And then I thought of having you as knowing a lot about indigenous people and knowing a lot about Gandhi, and they seem to be very interested in the joy of the path, not just the goal, but the joy of the path. What do you think would, it's not about knowledge, about the, it's about the in your Sanchita, number 2, the philosophical knowledge. What would your answer be? What is your experience about what makes life into an exciting adventure instead of a dangerous walk in the jungle?
Okay, first thing I want to say is these questions are great and they're also very difficult. So given that, I'll try to answer this. I think one of the things that I've realized is that people who are able to feel like life is a lot lighter and that life is an adventure are people who tend to be a lot more socialized into the environments that they live in, because they're able to get that safety needs met in the environments they're in. So I think one of the things that's really important is for you to feel safe in the places that you're in, and then you're able to experience other things like joy and adventure and happiness. But I think if you're feeling fundamentally out of place in the environment that you're in, or if your values are very different from the environments that you're in, looking at life like it is a dangerous walk in the jungle might be what is more likely to happen. So I think it's very important the communities that you're in and the communities that you're part of, in order for you to get more out of the state of survival and more into a state of being in the present to have your needs met. And I think these things can happen in so many different ways. Community is definitely a big part of it, but I also think it's really to get out of a place of survival. So I think I don't know if I'm sure you've heard of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So as much of your needs are met and the more of your needs are met, so those can be physical needs, emotional needs, you're getting water on time, you have shelter, then you're able to move into more, into deeper needs, such as self-realization needs, right? Of joy and adventure and happiness. And I think these things only happen once you're able to meet those fundamental needs. And one of the things I've realized in the communities that I have been working with is even when they're not able to meet their physical needs, they're able to do so by maintaining certain relationships within their communities as a way of meeting their needs. So those are the 2 things that I've seen.
Just a quick point, Lars. I think whether we are able to enjoy or be scared and afraid, I think depends on whether we are willing and able to acknowledge the truth with a small t, which means that we need to be able to acknowledge that it is inevitable that there will be unknowns and there will be uncertainties. Once we are able to accept and acknowledge those 2, there's no fear. There's no reason to be afraid of anything, because it's just the way things are. That's how the world as we know it is, that we can only know so much and we won't know what's going to hit us next moment. You don't have to be in a jungle. I can just drop dead with a heart attack at my age at any moment. So I think it's just this issue of whether we look at our truths and as a small t or a capital T, because if this distinction between small t and capital T that I think carries with it, whether we are willing and able to accept uncertainties and unknowns, or whether we think we know everything, therefore anything that threatens or questions us, we are apprehensive and anxious and scared.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. Over to the next raised hand is Christian Baumhauer. Floor is yours.
Yeah, in my group, we had also an exchange where people from, well, Yugoslavia, from Netherlands, and from France. It's quite a few interesting intersections because we all had been involved with German at some stage, either teaching it or learning it or studying in Germany or being a German citizen originally. So much about commonalities. We kind of came up with two questions. One is, I think, more for Sanchita, which is about this. Okay, she talked about this importance of kind of putting different perspectives together. The villages, say the indigenous, the modern, the postmodern knowledge, in such a way that. But the question is how do that practically, so that when you kind of come together, new knowledge emerges and gets exchanged. Okay? Because you also mentioned that, well, it's not easy for people who don't have a relationship with money to understand knowledge which is related to money. Or inversely, I think I can very well imagine an investment banker or management consultant from New York. I've been working and living with some of those in the past, kind of coming to a village and kind of people telling him, it's sufficient to work 3 days in a week. And then if I'm done, then I kind of just relax and kind of enjoy life differently. So that was my first question. My second question was different. Well, we talk a lot about the importance of mistakes. And I'm the first one. I kind of even formulate a radical position that all learning kind of somehow involves dealing with mistakes, and accepting mistakes is part of the learning. But what do we understand by a mistake? Right? Because that's one of those obvious things which it might be worthwhile being questioned. So here you go.
Seems we should maybe start with Sanchita because it was directed to you, but yeah.
Sure. I think I'll take the first question, and I think Barun might be better at the second one.
Let Barun take care of the mistakes, huh?
Yeah, I'll let he's older and wiser. I'm sure he's got this. Okay. So how do you do this practically? I think it's been very difficult for me. I've also, I think firstly, even before I started working with this community, I've always been surrounded by people who are very different from me. And I think despite that, moving to different parts of the world has been very different, because integrating a different way of being is just a massively difficult task. It's not just about being open-minded, but it's really about taking a certain perspective that's diametrically opposite to your way of seeing the world inside of you. And in which case you're constantly living with multiple truths being true, and it's very difficult to become certain about things. So this is difficult. And it's also difficult having these conversations, because how do you get two people who see money very differently in the same room to have that conversation without both people thinking the other person is really stupid, right? That's also really difficult, because it's really difficult to hear something that's different from yours, because your entire reality is shaped around. And I think this is why I brought in the concept of structures, because these structures make it impossible for you to even see into a different truth, right? And these truths are really different for some of these communities. For example, you can't really live with investment bankers in New York and tell them to work 3 days a week. It's just not going to work for them, right? And the same way, you can't really live in the indigenous communities and tell them to work every day of their week, not go to sleep. These things are just, it's almost absurd to them. It's out of their reality and it's out of their frame of mind. So to have these conversations is a really big task. I think what we can try to do is to start understanding why people think differently, how they think differently, and start with smaller aspects. So I wouldn't really directly go into money as a concept, but maybe just how do you relate to your family members, right? How do you talk to your neighbor? Because we're all talking to each other. And then maybe go into deeper conversations that are more difficult, where there's structures involved and it's a lot more complex. But yeah, this is a difficult task.
Great. Barun, I think the question was something along the lines of making mistakes is essential for the learning journey, but what are mistakes? Can we untangle what mistakes are?
Yeah, it's a good question to look at, actually. I think at a one level, mistakes are something that we don't expect from the proposition from where we are starting. And therefore, we figure that either there was a mistake in my pursuit, or there was a mistake in the proposition itself, so that we can reformulate it in a way that will meet the factual outcomes, explain the facts of the case. I think the other part of the mistake is more structural, which is this, and I think that's where much of the problem is, that we are unable to deal with the notion that our truth is actually a small t and not a capital T. And if we have that perspective, then it's almost impossible to break through, because then we are caught in a vicious cycle that our T is the only T, no matter what all the other senses and all the other information coming in and flooding us wants to say. We can virtually rule all that out by saying that we know and they don't. And therefore, a complete breakdown of dialogue itself. And this dialogue, what I'm talking, I mean, I'm sure I don't know much about the idea of Bildung, but the dialogue is not just between us, that is, 20 or 30 people at this meeting. The dialogue is within ourselves. The conflict is starting there. It is, so the mistake that we have, that we primarily make, I think, is our inability to scrutinize our own propositions and beliefs and have a dialogue with ourselves. And if we are able to have a dialogue with ourselves, then no matter how the group is, we will be able to at least have a engagement, if not a dialogue. And secondly, on the earlier point that Sanchita commented on, I think just think of earlier societies. We tend to think that we are the epitome of modern civilization and the world today, but every civilization at every point in history looked at itself in the same way. Because after all, they were the present then. So for instance, how did ancient societies, civilizations negotiated with each other? I mean, completely voluntarily, without any architecture of law that it was trans boundaries, for instance. I'm always amazed at how 2,000 years ago, from the west coast of India, they could trade with ancient Greece and Rome. What was the law governing that trade? Except trust and experience of the trust, or the breakdown of that trust. How did it happen? They didn't have a company law. They didn't have a trade law governing jurisdictions, yet they traded. Trade meaning not just the economic exchange, which of course is the most visible one, but exchange of ideas, exchange of whatever you have, exchange of people settled, they brought different cultures. How was it taking place?
Yeah, I think there's
we need to think of that.
Yeah, I think there's a very interesting book, maybe you have read it, by David Graeber about the 5,000 years of history of debt. And that's 5,000 years of history of debt. Very interesting how different cultures, civilizations have dealt with that. And in which circumstances the way that people would deal with trust and reciprocity would work out positively, and when it would kind of turn more and more, let's say, negatively, at least seen from our standards. Let's say people getting killed, people trying to conquer each other with violence, what have you. And this issue of trust, which was kind of, I think it's in all societies, but it's being handled very differently. Okay? And I think that's an interesting one. And to come back to what Sanchita said, I think for me, this is a very important practical question. Because if we had in the previous session something about trying to identifying that we have got more in common than what we have got difference. And the differences are what makes our diversity and allow us to kind of understand that we have got so much in common. But then, I think it's still interesting for the investment banker in Manhattan to have this exchange with Villager and vice versa. And the practical question is, how do you kind of make that? And that's certainly a collaboration flow. You don't kind of organize a meeting and then they talk to each other and then it's done. It's somehow a process of collaboration, which is much more sophisticated and complex. And one of my pet interests is how to kind of make these kind of collaborations possible and make them happen, which is all about different forms of dialogue, not necessarily dialogue to kind of convince each other, but to kind of learn and discover what we can kind of bring to each other.
A long string of small truths with a small t. Huh? Thank you so much for this, and we're having too much fun, but we need to break the session because it's time for a rounding up, and we are going to, and we say very much thank you to Sanchita and Barun for what you have shared, and also the insights and the confusion you leave us with, which is so healthy for us. We are rounding up by looking at the word cloud, I hope. Robert, do we have a word cloud? Which is then the summing up of your reflections on what makes us relate better with other people and or the planet. The ones you wrote in the beginning in the chat. Oh, there we go. Curiosity, empathy, love, courage, norms, cognitive synchronization. Yeah, there you go. Artful dialogue. It's a piece of art. It's beautiful. And of course, we will have one word cloud per session also. So it's really interesting because we can compare the different culture zones and follow them. So you look at the similarities and the differences, which also seems like a theme of the day, to unite in plurality. We would also like to remind you that this is not the first or the last meetings on Equinox. There will be one in September again, September 20 to be precise. So we really hope that you join us then as well. Also, Lena, maybe you can show that link.
Yep, I just shared the link in the chat. And if you go there, you can actually register for the Zoom meeting already. I put the wrong date into the Zoom meeting, but it will be the right Zoom link and the right sign up. I'll go fix that. And you can also let us know if you would like to become a co-organizer, if you would like to become one of the speakers, or you might want to become a global meeting on Equinox ambassador, because we would like to involve more people in doing this. So if you follow the link in the chat there, you can let us know if you would like to join organizing this or contributing to it in other ways, and of course signing up, and there will be more info as soon as we have some speakers. Now we just have the link. That's a place to start. Thank you all for joining. Thank you Sanchita and Barun for your presentations. Thank you Martin for hosting, and we're gonna close down the Zoom room now for 10 minutes because if we don't, Zoom will keep recording, and we have tried not to shut down after each meeting, and we ended up with 8 hours of video that we could barely get out of Zoom without the computer crashing. So, so we shut down the Zoom room, and then we will be back in 10 minutes, and then in 15 minutes we will meet in the Middle East. So looking forward to seeing you in the Middle East in 15 minutes, and thank you for joining.
Thank you. See you soon.